with Semper Fi aviation videos. And as you can see, again, I'm in my den. I'm not in front of my airplane. It's still down waiting on some parts. I made a video a few weeks ago about buying and owning a classic J3 Cub. I got a lot of questions and started thinking and looked through some J3 ads, and I thought I'd do a video on how to decipher a classified ad for a Piper Cub. Pilots tend to use a lot of acronyms and shortened abbreviations for things, and if you're not real familiar with them, you might not know what that means. So we're going to go through a couple of classified ads. I pulled these out of Barnstormers, which is probably barnstormers.com, the biggest depository of classified ads for everything related to airplanes. There are some other ones like Traded Planes, but Barnstormers is a pretty popular one. That was where I found my airplane. So let's take a look to start off at this first ad. This first ad, it says it's for a 1945 J3 Cub. You remember Cubs were built basically from about 38 to 1947. So this is a 1945 J3 Cub. First thing the ad says is it has an 0200 Continental. Now, Piper Cubs were built under basically 3 type certificates, or TCs. One type certificate for each engine that Cub had when it left the factory. The 3 type certificates were for Continental, Lycoming, and Franklin engines. The most common you'll see in classified ads is Continentals. That's how most of them were built. Continental engines ranged from about 40 horsepower up to about 100 horsepower. The early versions had A in front of them. A40, A50, A60, A65, A75, and so on. These are often put in ads as C65, 85 for Continental. That's not important. Just understand that if it's a 60 or 65 or an 85, that is basically a 85 horsepower engine or a 75 horsepower engine. Now, an 0200 is not a 200 horsepower engine. 200 is when Continental switched over to using the displacement of the engine for the model number. A 200 Continental is around 100 to 108 horsepower depending upon the version. Now, it's important to look at what the engine is for several reasons. One, bigger engines are heavier. Also, if it's an engine that's not on one of the original J3 Piper Cub type certificates, that clues you into what certain paperwork you want to see in the logbooks to make sure that it is a legal engine installation. One of the first things you'll want to do is look at the data plate on your airplane, and you'll want to get a picture of that from the person who has the classified ad. You'll want to look at the serial number. You can go online and look up the serial number, and there's ways to find out what type certificate that airplane was originally built under. So if you had a type certificate for a Cub that left the factory with a Lycoming, and it now has a Continental 85 sitting on the nose, that's not a problem. However, there's going to be certain required paperwork entries in the log to make that legal. Okay, next we have TTAF 3910. TTAF is generally total time airframe. You will also sometimes see TTAE, which is total time aircraft and engine, or you'll see total time E, TTE, total time on just the engine, because the engine will get replaced and rebuilt over the course of the lifetime of the airplane. So this airplane has 3,910 hours. On a 75-year-old airplane, that's only an average of about 50 hours a year, so that's not a big deal. The next acronym you have there is SMOH 214. That is since major overhaul. That was the last time that somebody significantly got in and tore the engine down. Now, overhaul is not really a legal term. What overhaul is to one person might not be the same as what an overhaul is to another person. So although it says the engine was overhauled, you would need to look in the logs to see what they actually did to the engine. Did they replace parts? Did they replace the parts with new? Did they replace parts with serviceable used parts? Because you don't have to rebuild the engine to new, you just have to rebuild it back to its certificated limits, which if you have an engine that is just beyond limits, as far as compression or bearings or the crankshaft or something, you don't have to restore it back to new, you have to restore it back to within limits. So you can have a newly overhauled engine which is still on the back end of its parts lifetime for some things in there. And the logs are going to tell you that. So if somebody says, well, I overhauled the engine 200 hours ago, okay, what did you do at overhaul? Did you replace the cylinders? Did you replace the crank? Did you regrind the crank? Did you put another used crank in it? What exactly did you do? You're going to want to ask those questions, and you're going to see evidence in the logbook matching up to what they tell you. Okay, next this ad says 12-gallon tanks left and right. There is a STC, supplemental type certificate, for adding additional fuel tanks, usually in the wing roots of the airplane. Sometimes you'll have just one in one wing root. This airplane has an additional 12-gallon tank in each wing root. Now, they hold about 12 gallons apiece. That adds the total fuel for this airplane to 36 gallons rather than the 12 just in the header tank. As this ad mentions, it still has the header tank. So that's a lot of gas. It's also a lot of weight. It's about 270 pounds just in gas if you fill it up. And we'll talk more about weight in just a second. Now, next for this airplane, we get into some what I think are substantial modifications that you'll want to be aware of. First, it has a Bnc Starter. This Bnc is a brand name. The other big brand name is Skytech. This is a starter, so you don't have to hand prop the airplane. Well, starters run off electricity, so we're going to have some type of electrical system in this airplane to run this starter. This Skytech Starter also adds weight. This ad next says it has Wieland strobes. Wieland is a brand name. There are other brand names. These are the white strobe lights that you can put on the wingtips or various other places in the airplane to increase visibility. You also have to have them if you're flying at night. Since all he says is strobes and not nav lights, I would assume he is not equipped this airplane to fly at night. He just added strobes to make the airplane more visible during the day, which is not a bad thing. However, the Wieland strobes do require electricity and they do add weight. Okay, Cleveland brakes and wheels. As I mentioned in my other video, this is one of the common upgrades. It's either with Cleveland or Grove, the other brand name, disc brakes with new wheels. This is a very common upgrade. You'll want to see the appropriate log entry. And they do add a little bit of weight, but it's a very, very common upgrade. A lot of Cubs you find are going to have the disc brakes, either Cleveland or Groves. Next, it has a Becker. Becker is a brand name, COM, and a transponder. COM is radio. It's got a Becker radio and a transponder. Now, I don't know if this transponder is ADS-B, which is the modern standard for transponders. It just says transponder. So I'd want to ask that question, because the modern air traffic control system requires an ADS-B transponder, which is more expensive than a basic transponder. So this says transponder. Okay, is it an ADS-B? You want to ask that, because if it's not, then that transponder is basically a boat anchor. You're going to have to spend a couple $1,000s getting that transponder up to modern standards. It also has an Artex ELT. This is an emergency locator. It's a small box that goes off if it gets wet or suffers a bunch of G's, and it helps search and rescue come and find it. Most Cubs you find now are going to have ELTs in it. Mine does. That's very common. They're very small and they're very light. Shoulder harnesses. The original Cubs only had a lap belt. Many people add shoulder harnesses that go over your shoulder to add additional crash safetiness. This is generally a good idea. Doesn't add a bunch of weight. My airplane doesn't have shoulder harnesses. When I restore it, I probably will add shoulder harnesses. They are a nice safety upgrade. And then he mentions he has a bunch of new instruments, a new compass, a new airspeed, a new tach, a cylinder head temp, an exhaust gas temp, and a voltmeter. These are all new instruments he replaced. That's generally good. It also actually helps on the weight, because generally the newer instruments are lighter than the original instruments they put in your airplane. So that actually helps. Sight gauges. The wing tanks that he has in the wings will have a small piece of glass tube that is visible when you look up on each side of the wing roots to see how much gas is in the gauge, rather than having a mechanical gauge on your dash. The sight gauges are also generally more accurate than the mechanical gauges. VGs, Vortex generators. These are small pieces of metal that are placed at various spots around the wing. You can also put them on the tail. I won't get into the physics of it, but they make more efficient airflow over the control surfaces and or wing, depending upon where he has them. Tends to make the airplane more controllable at low speeds. It also will lower the stall speed of the airplane, and it's just an improvement to the flying qualities. You see lots of airplanes with Vortex generators on them. Now, LSA Compatible, that stands for Light Sport Aircraft. Now, Light Sport Aircraft is a new type of aircraft certification that they came out with a few years ago for smaller airplanes. Now, it's interesting that this is in there because every J3 that is still flown legally within its certification is a light sport aircraft. Now, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about weight, because I mentioned adding an electrical system and adding a weight, because there's a few things in this particular ad that you would want to be aware of if you're thinking about this airplane. Okay, the first thing I'll mention is the weight. Now, Piper Cubs were built with basically 3 different gross weights, about 1,100, 1,170, and then 1,220 pounds. If you have an older Cub that was originally built with a gross weight of 1,100 or 1,170, depending upon the serial number, there is a way to increase the gross weight up to 1,220 pounds. You do some things with the landing gear, you do some things with modifying the struts. There's a few other things you have to do. However, this is important. It depends upon your serial number. There are some serial numbers that cannot be upgraded to 1220 and you are stuck with the lower gross weight. Now, it says this Cub is a 45 and pretty much all Cubs built in 45 with a 1,220 pound gross weight. A light sport aircraft has to be less than 1,320 pounds. So every J3 Cub that's flown legally is a light sport. So that's repetitive, but if you didn't know that, that's just telling you that it's light sport. Being light sport is important because there is also different medical requirements for the pilot's licensure in having light sport. That makes it easier to fly, easier to maintain your light sport license than to maintain your private pilot license. So that's why it's a benefit to be light sport, because there's more people out there with licenses who can fly them. So that's generally a good thing. Now, back to weight. Since this airplane cannot weigh more than 1,220 pounds, it has had some significant modifications to it that increase its weight. It's got a bigger engine, carries more fuel, it's got a starter, it has strobes, it has a transponder, an ELT. It has a lot of things that have probably added several hundred pounds, especially at full fuel. Well, if you take 36 gallons of gas, that's about 200 pounds or more. Plus you add probably another 50 to 70 pounds worth of battery and transponder and radio and strobes and the extra plumbing for the tank. Well, you're down to an airplane that's sitting there with full fuels maybe weighs 800 or 900 pounds. Well, you're getting very close to having a single seat airplane at this point. Now, that's fine. This airplane's probably quite a performer, and since it has a transponder and things, you can fly it anywhere in the country you want, but you're going to be flying there alone, at least legally. Now, it is important to mention about the transponder and the radio. Every airplane built now has to be ADS-B compliant. It has to have a transponder which meets ADS-B standards to fly anywhere in the country. The FAA allows airplanes that were built without an engine-driven electrical system to not have a transponder, and you can fly in most places in the country. You can't fly in Class B or Class C airspace, but you can fly everywhere else. So you can still do a lot of flying wherever you want to go. However, once you add that radio and transponder into the airplane, you have now changed the airplane into having an engine-driven electrical system, and you are stuck with always maintaining a transponder and things in that airplane. So if that airplane was properly documented in the logbooks that you added these electronics, you have now changed your Piper Cub into a modern certificated airplane as far as having to maintain ADS-B requirements. So this would be a very difficult plane to take back to the basic non-electrical system airplane that it once was. That's something you need to be aware of. Now, if you want a high-performing single-seat J3 that you can fly in Class B airspace, this might be your airplane. But there's some things about this that have changed this airplane quite substantially from its original classic way it left the factory. Okay, let's look at our second ad. Our second ad is a 1946 Piper 3, and it says clipped wing with reed conversion and metal spar. Now, as I mentioned in the other video, Piper Cubs were originally built with wood spars. Somewhere in the spring of '46, they switched over to metal spars. Now, you will find a lot of airplanes that have been restored in the last 70 or 80 years that have had the wood spars replaced with metal spars. It's not a problem. It's a common upgrade. I think it's an improvement, but you'll want to see that documented in the logbooks because that's a significant alteration. Now it says reed conversion. Reed is the most popular clipped wing conversion. It has a set of instructions. You remove a couple of the wing panels on the outboard wings. You shorten your wingspan. It makes your airplane a little bit faster. It makes it roll a little quicker. And they look pretty cool. When you see one sitting on the ground, they look a little sharper with the wings a little bit shorter. It does make some changes to the structure of the airplane, and you have to specifically follow the reed conversion to do it legally and make the appropriate logbook entries. There are some other clipped wing conversions out there that are not reeds, that some of them might have been done legally, some of them might not have been done. Since this one said reed conversion, I would expect in the logbooks to find the paperwork referencing the instructions and the drawings and plans that they closely followed the reed instruction so that you're legal to fly your clipped wing Cub. Now it next says flight controls and pulleys replaced. The control system of a Piper Cub is a lot of steel cables and pulleys placed at various places around the airplane, and these get a lot of use when you fly, so it's common when you restore an airplane to upgrade the pulleys and upgrade the cables, and that's common. 2,700 total time airframe. We also mentioned that before. 2,700 hours is fairly low use for a 75-year-old airplane, so that doesn't give me any cause for concern. It next says heavy lift struts front and rear. As I mentioned a minute ago, increasing your gross weight of your airplane required you to make several changes in parts, and one of the parts you usually had to change, depending upon what Cub you were starting with, was to replace the wing struts with heavy lift struts. They're slightly larger, they have slightly bolts at both ends, and some other things that make them heavy lift. Now it doesn't say what they did with this airplane. It doesn't say that it originally was a lower gross weight but was moved to a higher gross weight. It doesn't say that. It says it's a 1946. 1946s were all 1,220 pounds, so it should have had the heavier struts when it left the factory. So I'd want to ask the person, what do you mean heavy lift struts? Do you mean the ones that left the factory with, or are they different than the ones that left the factory with? Because it should have had the larger struts initially because it's a 46. It's not a problem, it's just some questions I'd want to ask the owner, what does this mean? He next says C85-12. Okay, he's referring to a Continental 85. The 12 is a model number. All the engines had a various number after the 85 or the horsepower, like 6 or 8 or 12. That just tells you what model of the 85 it was. But it's a Continental 85. Now, this Cub possibly had the 85 included when it left the factory, or it might have been upgraded later under the original type certificate, but you're going to want to look in the logs to see that that was done properly. However, that is a very common engine to have in a Piper Cub. Makes it quite a performer. Next it says Skytech Starter. Skytech is a brand name. The other airplane we just talked about had a different kind of starter. This one has a Skytech. Skytech adds a few pounds. It has to run off some type of electrical system. And you notice later it says standalone battery. What this means is they have a battery installed in the airplane to run the starter. However, it's not run off an engine-driven electrical system. So when you park the airplane in your hangar, you hook the battery up to a charger and you recharge it. So he has a starter, but he's not changed the airplane into an electrical engine-driven system so that he maintains the rule about not having to have a transponder. So that would be good. That's what he's talking about there. Now back under the engine, he says only 260 hours since major overhaul. That makes this a fairly low time engine. One of the first things you're going to want to ask is, when was the overhaul? Was the overhaul in 1960 or was it in 2015? So has this engine been rebuilt and then sat in a hangar and not run, which is very bad for engines, or has it been recently rebuilt and overhauled? And then of course, like the other airplane, you want to see the logbook about the overhaul and see what they actually did. Was it some guy who did it under the shade of the airport and he used parts he had around his hangar, or was it actually sent off to a professional engine shop like Matatuck or something? You're going to want to know that because there's some big differences in the value of what that overhaul means. He next says 8-gallon auxiliary tanks. So like the previous airplane had 2 auxiliary tanks that were 12 gallons, this one has one 8-gallon auxiliary tank. It doesn't say, but I imagine it's in one of the wing roots. So that's a common upgrade. If you have the higher horsepower, 85 horsepower, it's going to burn more fuel, and it makes sense to add a few more gallons than the 12 gallons. Great compression, clean oil. What he's talking about is when they tested the engine compression, it still had strong compression, meaning the top end of the engine, the cylinders and pistons and rings were still in good shape, and clean oil. He might have this airplane on a oil program where whenever you change the oil, you get the oil tested and they look for small flakes of metal in them to see if there's a problem inside the engine. This one says clean oil, so he's telling you that he watches the oil and it's coming out clean. He's just trying to tell you that the inside of the engine is in good shape. Nice interior. There's not a lot to a Cub interior. There's black seats, yellow fabric, and an instrument panel, but you can have newer ones or older ones. It looks nice. He also mentioned that he has shoulder harnesses. I talked about that earlier. That's a common upgrade. Now lastly here, would make this ad probably worth looking into initially. All paperwork log STCs and 337s. Now STC is supplemental type certificate. There are several approved modifications to the airplane, and these are generally done under an STC. Some company like Univair or Piper will own a STC. You generally pay them a set of money. They send you a set of instructions, tell you how to do the upgrade, and tell you how to make the appropriate logbook entry so it's done legally. This might be an engine upgrade, it might be the brakes, it might be the auxiliary tank, it might be the struts. There's a bunch of them out there. But he's at least telling you that he knows what STCs are, and he's got them all organized in the logbook so you can go through it. 337s. 337 is an FAA form that you fill out whenever you do what's considered a major alteration. So if you taxied your airplane into a landing light and had to fix a hole in the fabric, that would be a 337. Recovering it, fabricating it, fixing the propeller. It's just basically whenever you do a certain level of maintenance on the airplane, it has to be documented with a 337. So if you're looking at the airplane and you see evidence of a repair, whether it's a new piece of welded tubing on the fuselage or a fabric patch or something else, you're going to want to look in the logbook to see that there's an appropriate 337 on that improvement, on that repair. Now, the reason I mention things about the heavy weight and the STCs and the engines, these are very, very important details that you need to look at. Because the way the FAA looks at it, if you are flying an airplane with an alteration without a 337, or if you're flying it with an unimproved engine that's not even allowed to be on a Cub, or it's perhaps an allowed engine but there's no logbook entry. Suppose your Cub was originally built with a Franklin engine and now it's got a Continental 65 on the front. Well, there's nothing wrong with having a Continental 65 on the front of your Cub. However, if it's not appropriately documented in the logbook because the airplane originally had a Franklin, then the FAA considers that airplane illegal to be flown. Now, something I want to mention lastly about weight, both of these ads, neither one of them lists the empty weight of the airplane. If I was looking to buy a Piper Cub, if I called either of these people, that would be the very first question I asked them was, what's this airplane's empty weight? Because, as we mentioned before, 1220 is the maximum, maybe 1170 is your maximum, depending upon the airplane. I'd want to know the empty weight. There are a lot of Piper Cubs out there flying around that are basically single-seat airplanes legally. Now, you can put more than 1,220 pounds in a Cub and it will fly. But if you have an airplane whose empty weight is 900 pounds and you still put fuel in there and put 2 people in there, so you're 1,350 pounds, and if you go fly and you hit something or have an incident, I can guarantee your insurance company is going to look at that and they're going to go through your logbooks and they're going to say, well, you had an unapproved engine, you didn't have a 337 on this repair, and you were overweight, and they're going to deny coverage. So you want to make sure that your airplane is legal to fly. Sounds strange, but if you have your airplane and you hit something and you're asking them for money, one of the first things they're going to want to see is your logbooks. The airplane logbooks to go through and your logbooks to see if you were legal to fly it and to see if your airplane was legal to fly. Okay, I hope that helps. These are 2 common ads. You might occasionally see something in an ad that's different, but these are common things. You're going to want to look at the weight, you're going to want to look at the electrical system, you're going to want to look at the engine, you're going to want to look at the times if it's been restored. These are the kind of questions you want to ask. So hopefully this helps. If you saw my first video on how to buy and maintain a Piper Cub and you decided you wanted to buy one and now you're looking at classifieds ads, I hope this helped. So in the meantime, if you liked the video, hit subscribe, and thanks for watching. Keep flying.